Hi, everyone, and welcome to the first episode of the Open Source Podcast, which is an evolution of the OpenStack and Beyond podcast. This is going to be the 12th and last episode of the OpenStack and Beyond podcast. This is February 22nd, 2017, and we're doing this episode in advance of Mobile World Congress coming next week. We'll be focusing on vCPE, open source, open standards. The OpenStack podcast underwent quite a bit of an evolution over the past few years. It started off as the OpenStack Israel podcast, and we brought stories from the innovation in Israel, and then slowly we morphed into the OpenStack and Beyond podcast. We realized OpenStack was more than just our local neighborhood, and we wanted to bring global stories, and even more than just OpenStack, stories about hybrid cloud and networking stories and containers. And then we realized that it's a little bit beyond OpenStack already as well, and so we evolved into the Open Source Podcast, and we think it can't get more general than that. And we hope that this podcast will really focus on a diversity of open source projects, a lot around NFV, open standards, open source, cloud native, containers, the works. So we look forward to continuing the momentum around this podcast and really driving the open source movement and everything that makes it a wonderful ecosystem. I'm Sharone Zitzman, sometimes host of the show. With me today is Oded Nahum, my co-host and colleague, who has quite a bit of mileage in the open source community, the OpenStack community, the NFV ecosystem. So Oded, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Sharone, and thanks everyone for joining us today. So just a quick
I'll
note.
let you tell you a little bit.
Oh,
yeah.
I was just going to introduce myself and what I do. I do what we call customer solutions, but in plain English, what that means is that I have a license to imagine things. And that's a really interesting and fun job because you get to use a lot of the things that we're seeing in the world of NFV and cloud and vCPE and open standards, and how do you put this imagination into the reality and into how these solutions come to life. And that's a lot of fun, and it's exciting to be seeing these solutions come to life. Sharone?
Excellent. So thanks for joining me, Oded. On our show today, we have Mark Weiner, CMO of Versa Networks, who has quite a bit of mileage himself in the NFV ecosystem. An early partner of VMware. We had this discussion with us is also Vanessa Little, Senior Manager of the NFV ecosystem and architecture at VMware. I hope I got your title right. Mark, I'll let you introduce yourself and what you do at Versa, and then we'll let Vanessa also say a few words.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for our podcast today, or whenever you are listening. As I mentioned, my name is Mark Weiner, and I lead the marketing efforts, working closely with our major provider customers, rolling out a range of vCPE type solutions, from software-defined WAN and software-defined security to a range of other NFV-enabled IT services.
Fantastic. Vanessa was on our show at MWC last year, but then that kind of was overwhelming at the event with so much going on, so we decided to do it as a pre-event this time. We always love having you on the show, Vanessa. We'll let you take it away.
Oh, thanks for having me. I always love being on this show, and thank you so much for not doing it during Mobile World Congress. It was a little hectic last time. That's both my favorite and my least favorite conference of the year. So I'm Vanessa Little. I'm the Senior Manager of NFV Ecosystem Architecture. So yes, you did get my title correct. So my primary focus at VMware is to work with our ecosystem of partners to build some integrated solutions and build some of those better together stories and more complicated architectures, as well as doing some of the more forward-thinking stuff and working with the open source community, working with the standards community to sort of influence the direction of the NFV landscape today. So lots of fun stuff.
Awesome. So we have the imaginers, the idea makers like Oded. We have those who facilitate like Vanessa, and then we have those the doers like Mark. So I think we have a good team today to present a little bit about the NFT ecosystem and specifically vCPE. So Oded, I think with your vast knowledge and your implementation work around this, I think you're best suited to take it from here.
Perfect. Thanks, Sharone. So maybe, we'll kick it off with, kind of maybe an easy question, maybe not, a little bit philosophical. But, vCPE and also SD-WAN, of course, is proven to be, the hottest thing today in the world of NFV and telcos and service providers, and everybody wants to do something around vCPE and SD-WAN. And when we started looking at these things, we can identify kind of two approaches to this idea of vCPE, and companies and people kind of have different ways of describing that. And I guess I wanted to get a sense from you guys, where do you see that? And what I'm referring to is what we call the centralized versus distributed deployment, right? Centralized means let's bring all of the functions back into our cloud, centralize them, and essentially the edges of the network become, very meaningless little devices that all they do is connect the user or the branch back into the cloud. The distributed is kind of the opposite, right? We are virtualizing the functions, but we are keeping them at the edges of the network and running them on commodity type of hardware like x86 and stuff like that. And kind of where do you guys see that? What's your views on this? What is better? What is worse? Why is that? And kind of the pros and cons of each view of that.
Certainly. Vanessa, would you like to take it first, or would you like me?
Sure, I'll weigh in a little bit. I think our opinions are going to cover two different facets of the challenges there. From an infrastructure perspective, when you start distributing your deployments, it pushes a lot of responsibility northbound into the orchestration layer, and you need to have a very robust monitoring and telemetry layer in order to be able to effectively maintain these deployments, where these challenges didn't exist previously when you had much smaller, more localized deployments. But it also grants you a certain level of flexibility in these distributed deployments, in that you now have the capability to use these different smaller data centers to fail over for each other. You have some built-in disaster recovery and redundancy that you never would have had with a centralized deployment. So while you need to have a little bit more intelligence up front in your orchestrator and in your monitoring telemetry, the doors that it opens for you in terms of flexibility for your deployment are exponential. What would you like to add to that, Mark?
Certainly, so have some viewpoints on that. I think it really depends on what the service is the provider wants to offer, which of those architectures, centralized or distributed, makes the most sense. We actually even have a diagram right in the homepage of our site, and I describe it as a thin branch versus a thick branch, depending where the majority of those DNS-based services will run. For example, taking let's say security. We actually have customers that are doing both models. We have customers that are targeting SMB and mid-market, and they have a thin branch approach or a centralized approach where the bulk of the security VNFs, all of them are running in the POPs, and they simply have a NID or at a bridging at layer 2 level or a static set of routing, sending all the traffic to those POPs before the traffic goes out on its destination. That's great for security. Fast forward to something like SD-WAN, where a lot of the decisions and logic need to be made right there at the customer premises, at the branch, before they go somewhere. Look at SD-WAN. You're making decisions at an app by app, application by application level. Are you going to be put over broadband? Are you going to be put over MPLS? If you're over MPLS, you got a private safe connection, maybe I'll do less security. Hey, this is traffic going, maybe it's going to Facebook, it's guest Wi-Fi, it's going over to the internet and broadband. By the way, I'm putting a whole set of 5 different security VNFs on it because that is unsafe traffic as opposed to branch to data center over an MPLS private connection. That cannot be done in a central fashion because that logic needs to be applied and the processing done in a distributed fashion. So SD-WAN being a good case, as we mentioned the use case earlier, that is one that has to be largely distributed. Maybe you've got incremental security. Hey, if the traffic is going back to the data center where my key apps are residing, I'll have an additional DNF running malware protection just to be triple sure before the traffic touches my servers. But again, if you've got a local internet connection getting terminated, just as an example, that security has to be there and be distributed and centralized beyond just doing the SD-WAN controller function won't cut it. So that's a little bit of, depending on the use case, which architecture may or may not work better, deployment and complexity of operation aside.
Okay, thanks guys for that. And, I'll play the role of an opinionated host and, weigh in with my own thoughts on the topic. I do agree with Mark that this is very use case, VNF, and probably network dependent. One of the things that we started looking at this from a location perspective, where do I run the function and where it makes most sense to run it, a lot of time depends on the conditions of the network. Right? There's things that absolutely makes no sense for me to backhaul traffic to the data center and then push it back into, the branch, just because it's easier for me to manage the function centrally. My argument here, and this is what I've been seeing, is that, and maybe an SD-WAN is not the perfect use case for that, because the SD-WAN do bring their own kind of forwarders and devices that they put in the edges of the network. If I look at this from I've got a commodity x86 box that somebody went and bought online, and they put it in their branch, and then they want some orchestration magic to happen and start instantiating virtual functions and doing service chaining. I think technically we're probably not there yet. They're seeing some stuff. I don't know if you followed the announcement. There was an announcement made 2 days ago about a big networking vendor about their solution that addresses this. And there's other solutions that we're seeing, but kind of what I've seen is that I'm still kind of struggling to see the matureness of this, that companies are willing to adopt this thing and really see the commoditization that it can deliver and the innovative services that it can bring. Next thing I want to bring up with you guys, again, this is one of my all-time favorite discussion topics when we talk about the vCPE, and it has kind of two elements to that question. But I want to talk about the business model and the market around vCPE and SD-WAN. And the follow-up question to that is, how does open standards and openness in general plays a role in influencing the way that these decisions are made? And I'll kind of give a bit of a background to what I'm asking. Since the first day I bumped into this idea that's called vCPE and SD-WAN, I thought, this has to be seen from a business perspective. This is a business case type of an exercise, not so much of a technology exercise, because technology has existed. We're not really innovating on the technology. We're innovating on the way that the solutions are being delivered. And then you start looking, okay, what drives that? What makes that business model stick? What makes it interesting? Is it the ability for me to consume services in a cheaper way? Is it the cost? Is it suddenly I'm provisioning services from a self-service? Kind of what drives that? And do we see any standardization today that drives that behavior? Vanessa, you want to go first?
Yeah, I'll jump in first. So I think there are two distinct markets when you're talking about vCPE and SD-WAN. One is the enterprise market who wants to deploy this solution to drive their own costs down. They have several remote offices, branch offices that they need to aggregate. They want to reduce the cost of their network links. So instead of having to pull an MPLS loop to every remote office, which in some cases isn't always feasible or available, now they can leverage things like LTE and broadband by deploying these types of solutions. Those guys are really driven by reducing the cost of their infrastructure. There's also some cost reduction in their OpEx models, in that it's a lot easier to maintain this type of infrastructure, whereas before you needed dedicated IT infrastructure staff to do so. Now it's a lot simpler. There's a lot of tools available on the market to make deploying these solutions and maintaining them really easy. The second half of the market is a service provider market who wants to sell this solution at scale to those enterprise customers. So their drivers are more How many of these solutions can they deploy on the least amount of infrastructure? How simple is it to maintain? How simple is it to operate the life cycle of this? And how easy is it to add additional services that are going to add value to the customers and drive their revenue? So I think cost is always, and cost reduction is always going to be one of the biggest market drivers. Being able to offer self-service is compelling to both markets, but I wouldn't call that the biggest driver. I would say that's probably a secondary driver. I would flag cost reduction and price as the biggest driver. What are your thoughts on that, Mark?
Great points, Vanessa, and I agree with all those that you brought up, particularly on the self-service piece. No.
Nope, you're still here.
Great. So I was saying, Vanessa, I totally agree with your points there, particularly even on the self-services that's definitely a secondary or tertiary point. We've ourselves done a global survey. We had about 308, 310 mid to large enterprises respond. Was also actually working on a multi-vendor project with heavy reading. And I was just going with the analysts and through their survey results for a recent survey as well, fairly similar results. On the enterprise side, the feedback, that was mainly our survey, the feedback, certainly price was a key one. Whether it's the cost they have today, both the bandwidth and the broader TCO of all the appliance stack, their issue is how do we grow bandwidth? How do we have like example of a bank that wants to put a high-end multimedia application in. They're going, we can't do that with MPLS. We cannot just afford, given the cost per meg. So as we roll out new apps, we continue to digitize and transform the business. We need new network options to do it, like broadband. That's a key driver along with cost, partially the cost is how do we continue to innovate? We can't do it with bandwidth constraints. That's one. We're not getting rid of MPLS, but as we grow and transform, we need additional things for that. Number two, the continued migration to SaaS apps. That's driving both the providers supporting the enterprise and the enterprise directly. I believe it was by the end of last year, the majority of workloads, computing workloads, are actually occurring in the cloud, not on premises. It's like 55, 45%. So given that, again, enterprises are saying, I do not want to have traffic go over my MPLS to my data center, burn data center infrastructure, to go out to the cloud, to add latency when I can have a pipe directly from the branch to the cloud. And I'm getting zero value out of going through the data center, short of maybe a bit of security. So key trend is as more and more workloads leave the data center to go to the cloud, the network has to transform to support that change in IT and in workload. So I think that's another driver for the enterprise, probably secondary given our survey results to cost, is just the shifts in either new apps and digitization or apps going in the cloud. Shifting to the service provider side, and again, some of the forecasts we've seen in the SD-WAN market, it's about 50-50, at least looking at IDC's numbers for enterprise revenue versus from the provider. Provider is going to be a few things. It's going to be just getting out of the pure MPLS transport market into we want to add higher value services to customers. Obviously, SD-WAN and app smarts and all that is adding extra value beyond just doing MPLS as transport. That's one. Two, just a more dynamic service. How can we have much more service agility using an open model like vCPE with VNF? We can just zero-touch provisioning. Bang, we can go out there, we can build a service, and we can provision branches in hours or overnight with a FedEx, not weeks to deploy a standard router and plug an MPLS circuit in. So service agility, providers tell us, they told heavy reading, et cetera, is probably number one. Lower TCO is number two. And number three is how can we add more valuable services on top of that over time, like gluing in security, gluing in WAN op, gluing in other items to continue to software define more elements. So I think those are it on the provider side.
Yeah, and just to add to that, one other trend that we're seeing on the VMware side is providers are very, very keen on not only the service agility, but being able to pilot new services to see what sticks and having that whole fail fast methodology, which was never available before when you're looking at, week-long engagements to do a truck roll, to do an install, to pull a loop, to pull physical fiber. Now, because none of those things are a factor, everything's run in software, everything's managed remotely. You can start offering new services very quickly. And if they don't work out, if they're not widely adopted by your customers, you haven't really invested that much. And it's not that big a problem to decommission it.
Fully agree. You got it, Vanessa. Fully agree on that. And even front-ending that, even to design the service is going to be a lot easier than having to put a bunch of boxes and standalone software in a lab facility and do it. Now, given that it's all virtualized, you can do that literally in probably days or weeks, not in months or quarters.
So guys, I don't want to. I want to bring that question back to kind of what was the second question about open standards in the world of SD-WAN, and I'll give you the context here. And Mark, this is really going to be a question for you. SD-WAN, by far, I completely agree with what you guys said. The drive is purely coming from the enterprise customer who wants to consume these services at a decent price. And you're right, it's the need for speed. And right now, MPLS just doesn't bring it, and the telcos are slow, to innovate and kind of address these issues. So the SD-WAN really came in to solve that very, very painful problem, and it did it in a very elegant way. One of the things that I've been seeing and hearing from telcos, right, and even from end users sometimes, is the fact that SD-WAN by itself brings a bit of a kind of unspoken lock-in, right? Because in a way, we're centralizing the controller element, which is very specific to the vendor, and we're putting forwarders at the edges, which is also very, very specific. And my question is, where are we going to see and when are we going to see some openness in that space? For example, I'm already invested, and as an end user, I bought a whole bunch of CPE devices from, you name it, vendor, right? And these devices have a lot of capabilities. Why can't I use them and tie them to an open SD-WAN controller? Just a wild idea.
Okay. So a couple of questions. The CPE that you have, is that proprietary CPE like a routing box or a WAN optimization box, or is that an open x86 type of CPE like some providers are calling it universal CPE?
No. It's let's name them. It's a Cisco ISR G2 or a Juniper MX 300 for the fun of it, right? Very capable device, right? Both of them, very capable. They have all the bells and whistles of networking and application optimization and visibility and all that kind of stuff.
And remind me, I'm not familiar with the exact units that you mentioned. Do those have an open? I know some ISRs have a UCS type, computing blade on it as opposed to purely running iOS or Junos. Is that
no,
formal where it has the ability to compute, or is it closed iOS or Junos?
Well, define closed. It's in iOS or Junos. It's open using either Netconf or whatever other stuff that they provide.
So again, and I may not be 100%.
It's not an x86 that you can put an image on it. That's kind of what I'm driving at.
Okay, then the answer is, and again, the answer is I do not, and I may not be 100% correct. Again, those would be then really closed devices to the same extent that a Riverbed WAN optimization box would be. Yeah, it can port things out, but unless you can run a software instance, that device was built to be a router maybe and a firewall and a couple of items. That device was not meant to run SD-WAN software any more than, you have a car and it wasn't meant to be a tractor or wasn't meant to be a forklift. It was meant to be a car. And you can put things on. It doesn't have places where you can put in there to have an uplift to become a forklift. To that same extent, I don't believe, unless it's, again, some of these, because some of the ISRs where it does have a UCS blade, we can absolutely and have instances where we do run on that on an open basis. But again, we have software, and the software needs to be hosted. If you have, it's meant to be hosted. I guess that's the best. The software needs to be hosted. You have a controller. I would say to some extent the SD-WAN it's not symmetric like a WAN optimization is, where you've got a pitcher and a catcher, one compresses, one decompresses. But on the other hand, the controller up front or in the head end does it, But again, it's controlling something down in the branch. And those prior traditional routing, for example, wasn't meant to be run and controlled by an SD-WAN controller. They're just apples and oranges. It can work alongside of, again, the other point I'll make, a router typically would be supporting the underlay or can easily support the underlay. The SD-WAN being the overlay. Hey, I'm identifying the application based on that and what policy I'm told centrally. Which circuit do I pick? That is an overlay that can work nicely with the router, but you're not going to convert the router to do all those functions because it needs to then be an SD-WAN device. They're different layers.
Okay. Vanessa, any comments on that?
Yeah, so I mean, even if you can't change the OS running on these CPE devices, you can still find a home for them within your SD-WAN or your vCPE topology. Just knowing that it's not going to have the full suite of functionality that you would if you know all of your endpoints were homogeneous. It's going to put a little more overhead on the orchestration and management of these devices because they're going to have different means of pushing config and monitoring them. But if you just wanted to have, you know, at the bare minimum, a complete layer 2 mesh, then you could use these as IPsec tunnel endpoints that get you out to your central office, and you could have connectivity there. Now, as Mark so aptly put, if you want to do the more advanced SD-WAN features and have you know, policy-based routing and being able to push certain apps locally as opposed to centralized, you're going to be pretty limited in what you can do there with those devices. But you know, if you just want to have them terminate your loops and join your layer 2 network, you totally can. You don't have to throw them out. But you know, there's a trade-off. You can reuse your old gear, and you won't be able to do everything you would like to do possibly. But you know, it's just you could see that as sort of a stepping stone, as an evolution to your network. You don't have to rip and replace everything to deploy a full SD-WAN solution. You can start adding it piecemeal without having to gut your entire network.
Actually, and I agree, Oded, I agree with Vanessa here 100%. Most of our customers, as a matter of fact, do not tear out their existing routers. A lot of them are still under depreciation and other, financial models. So most customers do not tear it out. They actually are adding a layer with SD-WAN, again, to make the network more app smart and app and policy driven. So it's an incremental layer that is being added. That controller layer.
I wasn't, the suggestion wasn't to, of course, remove these components but it was more of a philosophical question. When we talk about software-defined whatever, it's always about a separation of the control functions and the forwarding function. And what I'm saying and seeing in the world of SD-WAN is that separation hasn't happened yet, because we are failing to agree on the standards of what SD-WAN capability is and what I would like to see on the forwarding unit and what I would like to see on the controller unit. And can I have a mix and match type of a solutions which will drive the openness and adoption of this market? That was kind of the point that I'm trying to get at. And I do, by the way, my own opinion is that, yes, it's not ready yet. We're not there yet. There's not mature enough to adopt these models, but I would definitely want to see these models being adopted.
What I will say is across different SD-WAN vendors, not SD-WAN and traditional or legacy routing as a standalone, but across SD-WAN, there is some early work being led by the Open Networking Users Group, ONUG, Nick Lippis' organization. Yep. And that effort we've been active in, that's been going on now for probably 8 months. A lot of meetings last summer and some more restarting, where they're at least trying to get how do we potentially lay out some standards for one SD-WAN controller being able to touch or tweak another SD-WAN vendor's endpoints. So that at least amongst SD-WAN is getting worked on. But converting a router to be an SD-WAN device, that's unless those vendors themselves redo their code and as that ONUG effort moves along, that's not the case, because you're just talking, they're just different layers. You can't make something that's not app smart and they're opening up packets and identifying it's one of 10,000 applications to instantly do that. That's just those are different functions.
Okay. So
yeah, well, we're also seeing a bit of an evolution now with the Open Compute initiative and looking at white box network devices, being able to take a piece of hardware and completely change its personality just by pushing a new config to it. It's not really there yet, but the fact that there's so many people joining those standards and contributing to them and contributing to that code base is very interesting. It shows that the industry is looking more towards the capability that they want completely agnostic hardware that you can push anything to and make it become anything you want just with a matter of configuration. And so the separation between underlay and overlay is now just a matter of config, as opposed to traditionally, underlay was bound to physical hardware and overlay was an SDN function. We're starting to see a bit of a convergence there, and it'll be really interesting to see how that evolves in the next couple of years.
True, I agree. That's definitely an interesting and an area that I've been following quite closely to see how that plays out. We've got about 7 minutes left, and I do have one more question to ask you, but I want to also kind of open up the floor for you guys to bring up topics that you want to touch on, discuss, ask me, ask the other hosts on the call. Anything interesting that jumps out?
I would just like to pop in here and just talk about the event that we briefly mentioned in the beginning, which is such an important event for announcements in the industry. A lot of interesting things that are happening, talking about convergence and standards. And so we know that there are going to be some interesting announcements around open projects that people are waiting to hear about. And not just those projects, there are a lot of diverse technologies that come out and are announced at these events. So first and foremost, I want to ask our panelists if there's anything they want to share with us in advance of the event and something exciting that they want to share that their companies are about to announce. And aside from that, just the things that they're looking forward to seeing at MWC and how it affects the industry. So.
Yeah, I'll quickly jump in. So in true VMware style, we have a massive booth at Mobile World Congress, and we have a lot of stuff going on. We have a number of kiosks that are showcasing our partners and some of our solutions, and all the members of this call are included in that. And we have some interesting demos and presentations to see. We're also having a really big open community event called our VNF Onboarding Hackathon, which is especially relevant to this space where we're releasing some web-based tools that were generated in conjunction with Cloudify and Intel to make building Tosca blueprints very simple. And we're getting everybody together. We're inviting all of the VNF partners to come and join us, and we're gonna actually use the tool and take these blueprints and start extending and augmenting them so that we can build a community source library of all of these blueprints for all the various VNFs. So we're pretty excited about that. And I think it's going to be a really interesting show because it's something we've never done before.
Yep, we're excited too. We're looking forward to this collaboration.
Awesome.
We think it's really important, from an ecosystem perspective. And there's been a lot to say about, the standardization of VNFs and, everything in that ecosystem, SDKs. So we're excited to actually be participating in this co-innovation project. Mark, tell us a little bit about what you guys are doing at MWC.
For sure. So as VMware and Vanessa's team so kindly offered, we certainly, as she mentioned, will be both working with them in their booth as well as doing an interesting theater presentation coming up, really showing, just like our topic is today, what is the impact, for vCPE and SD-WAN of building that in an open environment. We'll actually be showing a validated solution and demonstrating that. That should be quite interesting. And then we'll also be working with other orchestration partners, showing various demos and interoperability in other locations around the show. And then we'll have our own meeting room, meeting with a number of, we actually have providers booked back to back during the course of the show. So look forward to hearing both what others are looking to do and how we can potentially help.
Cool.
I'll treat you like a panelist on this one, Oded. How about you chime in on your thoughts about MWC and what you expect to see and things you're looking forward to?
MWC, I've attended that event, a number of times, and it's one of the craziest weeks that one can experience, both as somebody who was visiting the event and somebody who's have a booth and actually exhibiting the event. But yeah, I think what we're going to do, and this kind of VNF idea that is very exciting, because we're big fans of openness and ecosystem, and let's all be friends and collaborate. And we're definitely seeing that need that needs to come from especially the VNF vendors. People who have VNFs needs to come forward and says, let's all agree on a language that we can work with. It's going to make everybody happy. It's going to make our customers and the end users happy. And it's going to make the VNF vendors happy, because now they have a lot more platforms that they can run on without the heavy lifting of creating integrations. So it's exciting. Too bad I'm not there, because I'm a big fan of Spanish food. But maybe next year.
You chose to not be there.
Yeah, but don't tell me.
I was there last year, though. It's a tough event. It's an exciting event, but it's a tough one.
Yeah.
Any last thoughts? You guys are welcome to just share a few last thoughts if you have them, and otherwise we'll wrap it up.
I just want to say thanks so much for having me on the show again, and looking forward to doing it again.
Thank you.
And thank you for having us as well, and I'm wishing you a both very well-resulting as well as enjoyable show.
Thanks, guys.
Likewise. Let's have an excellent MWC. And Oded, thank you for joining us today. And thanks, everyone, for listening.